Society Matters.
Hello and welcome to History Repeats. I'm on HMTV. I'm your host, Liam Carballal, and joining me once again is Richard Acritelli. Rich, it's good to have you back again.
Yeah, good to be with you today.
Yeah. So today I was hoping we could talk about the POW experience in the Pacific Theater during the war. The Japanese not regarded as being hospitable to POWs. Can you shed a little bit of light on that? Like, what's their history up to that point of treating POWs?
Well, what we spoke about in the last episode was that the Japanese, Russo-Japanese War, World War I, they had treated their prisoners of war with kindness, support. They had given the Russians probably more of their own needs than what their own government had given them. World War I comes to an end. The Treaty of Versailles. They asked for provisions, to be made of like racial, and ethnic, equality within
Treaty of
the
Versailles.
treaty. Europeans basically said, no, we're not doing that. So what you're looking at is the 1920s is now like a rapid growth of nationalism within Japan. They want to expand. They want to compete, with us, the British, the French, the Germans, I guess to a lesser degree. They had everything stripped from them during, World War I. So now you get into the 1930s, and now this nationalism now gets into a lot of military force, where they go into Manchuria and create Manchukuo, and they're trying to etch out that part of China. They go into Korea. So now you have a whole generation of army officers that have fought in these wars, and they have not shown any type of humanity towards the people that they're fighting against. They're in our way. They give up. We could treat them lower than a dog, Dakota Bushido. So the interesting thing is December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor hits, we do have a pretty large garrison in the Philippines. There's about 76,000 soldiers, 12,000 of them being American.
Philippine scouts.
The rest are Filipino scouts. The thing is that the Filipinos weren't really that well trained compared to the Japanese. And the Japanese were fighting throughout the 30s and the early 40s, and they had that mindset. We did not. These are Great Depression era kids. They're in uniform. The government is kind of aware that we're gravitating towards war. But it's like you look at Nazi Germany, the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, the fighting in Spain. You look at the Japanese, the fighting in China. Those countries had a completely different mindset, which is always amazing for the United States, because we're behind the eight ball sometimes, and we very quickly adapt and overcome, and we learn from our mistakes and so on. So when Japan attacks us in the Philippines, that was the jewel of our like imperial network of countries, territories, islands.
Guam, Wake,
Samoa, Hawaii. Well, it's later become a state. Samoa. I'm missing one here.
Alaska.
Well, Alaska, the Japanese will take two islands, but it will come back to me. So what you're looking at is that the Japanese ends up attacking, and MacArthur's the commander, overall commander in the Philippines. So he was the Army Chief of Staff, I believe, for 2 terms under Hoover, and then under FDR. He ends up going over there. One of his main aides was Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Eisenhower begged to get away from MacArthur in 1939. He just wanted to come back to the States. He had his time with MacArthur. I guess they got along because they were together for a long time, but they were completely different guys.
Yeah.
So as MacArthur's getting attacked, Eisenhower is actually in the war plans operations under Marshall now. Yeah. So now he realizes from his own time over there that there's a lot of difficulties now going to happen. You have two war plans. You have War Plan Orange and then War Plan Rainbow. War Plan Orange was to basically hold up in the major areas of the Philippines, right?
Against the Japanese.
Against the Japanese. You're in Manila, you're in Subic Bay, you're in Luzon, Corregidor. Stockpile weapons, food, resources, and try to have as many troops as possible where they're going to end up getting reinforcements.
Corregidor is a fortress.
The Corregidor is a fortress. It's almost like you would think of like Alcatraz in the middle of San Francisco or Fort Sumter down in Charleston. Yeah. It's a fortress. It's very well manned. There's tunnels there. It's kind of mountainous. It gets bombed, but the soldiers end up surviving there. So now what ends up happening is the Japanese attack in the Philippines. They have shorter supply lines, their communications, their reinforcements, everything is shorter. So now what you look at with MacArthur is through War Plan Rainbow, he tries to separate the American soldiers, put them into key areas where he's waiting for the Japanese soldiers. The problem is you have 7,000 islands. You know most of them are going to be smaller, out of the way, and so on. But you still have some very large islands. And what does he do? He basically cuts up our forces and he divides them. And the Japanese are very aggressive, very tough, and they want to go in for the kill. So December 7th, we get attacked, okay, at Pearl Harbor, but they attack all those other places as well, right? The Philippines, all the places, right? So the Japanese rising sun is really on the move. We're back on our heels.
You mentioned before one of the other islands. I don't know if there was another island, but I do know that we actually had 800 Marines stationed in Shanghai. And they were forced to surrender once the war began.
You had Americans all over the place. And it was really a dark time for our military, I would say, from Pearl Harbor, probably up until, I would say, Sicily Falls in Europe in the summer of 1943. And once we get through like Guadalcanal, okay, and, like New Guinea, as we start getting into that island hopping campaign, because we were really in the back, in the rear. We were so far from Tokyo in one aspect and Berlin the other aspect there. And it was a dark time period. We weren't prepared for any of this. So now you think, all right, are we going to be able to send reinforcements into the Philippines and resources and stuff like that? Outside of maybe some ships that made it through and maybe some of our own submarines, those men were left there to fend for themselves. So now Eisenhower's working around the clock. He makes a name for himself through the military maneuvers. Mark Clark actually is asked by General George C. Marshall, who would you recommend? You give me 10 names for this post. I'll give you one of them, and that's Eisenhower. So Eisenhower knew the terrain, he knew the islands, he knew what MacArthur had. Now MacArthur got some new B-17 bombers and some fighter planes and some resources, but they were left on the flight lines. Oh boy! And like at Pearl Harbor, they're left there. Why? Because Kimmel and Short, they are going to say, well, it's closer to guard against in terms of sabotage.
They you can keep a better eye. To be like directly.
You got a total onslaught. All right. So now that was not MacArthur's finest moment. So now what ends up happening is that slowly but surely they're getting pushed back, and they have to go back. Or if they get defeated, that could be it for all the forces. So now I believe it was March 1942. MacArthur's at Corregidor. FDR orders him out. He's going to take a PT boat. He's going to have the Filipino royal family with him in terms of the leadership. He's going to have his own senior officers with him. And he's going to tell General Jonathan Skinny Wainwright, keep on fighting.
Yep.
If you have to resort to fighting in Bataan, guerrilla warfare, you do that. You do not surrender. The problem is when those PT boats came in at MacArthur,
Yep.
they weren't bringing supplies in with them. They weren't dropping anything off. No men came in.
Yep.
All right. So they were like, I wouldn't even say that there was a blockade, okay, because there wasn't enough ships that were able to block that blockade. We were 7,000 miles away. At that point, it was just too far. Okay. It was just too much of a reach to throw those materials and resources that were probably going to get either sunk or captured, and they weren't going to make it there. So Wainwright, who graduates from West Point in 1906, he's in the Argonne Offensive. He does occupation duty in France and Germany in terms of World War I. He goes to the War College. He's in the Command and General Staff. He loves being in the cavalry. He's a hard drinking, but he's a pretty popular officer with his men. But Marshall didn't like him because I think maybe he thought the drinking got a little bit out of hand. But it's the military, though. Drinking is part of the military, right? Believe it or not, these guys are older guys. They're a lot of them World War I veterans. They're not making much money. They're in isolated posts. Sometimes they're away from their family. So he ends up sending them to Fort Hood, Texas. And then he ends up, serving with MacArthur, in Bataan and Corregidor. So Bataan and Corregidor is basically where the forces get backed up into. So now the Japanese had timetables, and they expected to hit certain places at certain times, and it would only take them so long. The problem with the Philippines is that even though we fought a brutal war in the Philippines, in the early 1900s, we were really there as occupiers and stuff like that after the Spanish-American War. The Filipinos probably gravitated more towards us than the Japanese. Like today, the Filipinos gravitate more towards us than the Chinese itself. And that's where those islands come in, because there's always friction today between the Chinese and the Filipinos. The Philippines is a large area. There are a series of islands, but they are a large area itself. So what ends up happening, MacArthur takes off. He ends up taking a series of transportation to get him down to Australia. His main goal is to get there in one piece and then reestablish U.S. Army. And several months later, they'll be back in Guadalcanal. Wainwright is looking at his soldiers. A lot of these guys are sick with malaria. They're wounded. There's very few medical supplies. They're on half rations. The Japanese knew they were on half rations. So a lot of times what they would like to do is the enemy would like to take prisoners that are alive, because they can get what they need to out of those prisoners in terms of what does it look like, the opposition against us. The intelligence itself there. All right, like Grant during the Civil War at Vicksburg would always say, let the prisoners through, give them food, give them water, because then they're going to give us information. And we have an understanding of what's going on behind their fortifications. Well, the Japanese might not have been given food and water, and they might not have been as kind as Grant was to some of the Confederate soldiers at Vicksburg. But they were grabbing onto some of these soldiers, and they were getting out of them that we don't have anything. And you could tell by their clothing, and you could tell that these men are skinny and they're malnourished. So now you still have soldiers within that Bataan area, and they're fighting. And they hate the Japanese, and they know they have to fight, because they're seeing that they might have to withdraw and retreat, but they do have to fight at certain points. All right? So now the Filipinos are fighting with them, and the Filipino people don't want anything with the Japanese there. So you look at the Germans, right? And you look at where we are here in the Holocaust Museum. The Germans enslaved people. They looked at people as lesser secondary, third people,
Intervention.
right? Yeah, like they didn't matter, right? Well, the Japanese did the same thing. Okay, in Vietnam and Korea and Thailand, Singapore, China, the massive atrocities. So what do you end up having from that line of thinking is a very hardened belief that life doesn't matter much. It doesn't cost much. Okay? And now you're looking at the American soldiers and they hate us for a couple different reasons. One, we're American. We're in the Philippines. We're not far from Japan. We had military power there. It might have been decimated, but we didn't stop fighting. Kept on going. And they knew we didn't have much and we kept on doing it. All right? So what does that do? That angers the Japanese fighting soldiers, okay? From the generals all the way down to the privates. Yep. You got to remember, in the Japanese army, okay, if you were a general, you could put your hands on a colonel. If you were a colonel, you could put your hands on a lieutenant colonel or a major all the way down.
Yeah.
So you could do bodily harm to enforce discipline. So they were hard with their own soldiers. Their own soldiers didn't have much food, and they were expected to march maybe 25 miles in a day, okay? Yeah. So when they look at the Americans, and when the Americans finally give up 2 months after MacArthur leaves, they have a very hardened look on the Americans. They see them as being inferior. They see them as upsetting their timetables and carrying out more casualties. Yep. They see them as being their main threat towards controlling the Pacific and Asia. Yep. All right. So, and there's no love lost. Okay. Time down the road, you're going to see Marines are going to cut off the ears of Japanese soldiers and send them home. All right. They're going to go after all the ships and major aircraft that carried out the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto, they're going to find him, the great organizer of Pearl Harbor. They break the Japanese code, but they don't state what they had done. They find him and they kill him in the air. So the resentment is so great against the Japanese. And what we're about to delve into is this is the start of it. This is one of the main reasons why. So now Wainwright is looking, okay, for General Hama, H-O-M-M-A, right? And you have other generals that are there, okay? But Wainwright is one of the key generals itself. He doesn't want to surrender. This is going to be the worst surrender in American history up until that point. The worst one, all right? Remember, the Civil War, Grant takes 3 armies, but he's taken 3 American armies. He's taken America. It's not an outside force coming in. Yep. All right? Here on Long Island, the Battle of Long Island was a disaster, right? It was one of the largest battles of the war. Battle of Brooklyn. Okay? You have War of 1812, Washington gets burned down to the ground. World War I, you have American ships being sunk just off of our coast. But 12,000 soldiers is a lot of soldiers. Yeah. And now they're going to fall into the hands of a captor that is not going to show any aid or comfort whatsoever to the American soldiers. Now, Wainwright finds him. Hama doesn't really even look at him. He really disregards his presence there. He sees him as low as a dog, okay? And he goes, well, you came here to surrender, and you hurt our timetable here. And they're very angry about that there, all right? Because they want to shift the resources and materials to other areas.
Something similar happened after the Battle of Shanghai. The Japanese were expecting a quick victory. Thousands died. But as the Chinese lines broke, the Japanese started taking prisoners. They got their revenge. The Japanese took revenge on Chinese prisoners, massacred thousands.
Yeah, and on their way to Nanking, they got out that this storm is now coming your way. Yeah. So now the storm was amongst us in terms of the Americans, and they were the first line of the defense there. If you think about it, they huge garrison. There was a lot of aircraft. There was some naval power there. I mean, we were there for a long time. And we were already talking about giving the Filipinos independence and stuff like that. And even during the Cold War up until, the late 80s, early 90s, we had military bases there. And now we're gravitating more there because of the threat with China today. So now Wainwright is telling his Japanese counterparts, my men are sick, they're wounded, they need food, they need water, they need care. Two things are going to happen, right? One, okay, is that the Japanese will not care about any of that, okay? And two, they didn't have those resources. And they didn't realize that they were going to take 76,000 soldiers, 750,000 men. So they didn't realize that, okay, one bit. So now they get taken and they're going to go to several camps. So like off air, we spoke about like Cabanatuan and O'Donnell and other camps as well, because not all those men are going to stay in the Philippines. Yeah. So now the Bataan Death March, and we might have to come back to because there's a lot to it. The Bataan Death March was something where there was no comfort whatsoever. This bottle of water would have been seen as being a lot of water for the American soldier. What is this? Two drinks maybe, right? Yeah. The American soldiers were not given any water. They were not given any food. You're wearing your glasses right now. You have a watch on. You have this. You have that. The Japanese take a rifle butt right to your face. They take your glasses. Why do you need glasses? In order to see. Yeah. You have these men, okay, that's part of their senses. They have their glasses taken from them. They have pens taken off of them, cigarettes, money, and so on. There was many accounts. If they found officers and they had rings from West Point, they cut their finger off. Oh, boy. And then they took that ring. So the ring was a prize because it was a trophy because of what it stood for. They knew West Point. You got to remember, you have a lot of Japanese immigration to the United States. Some of them go back. They don't all live here. There's a lot of them that are educated here, and they were interpreters during the Bataan Death March. So here you're an American soldier, and they knew the areas that you might have been from or areas of America, and they would mock you. You're never going to go back to Long Island. You're never going to see New York City. You're never going to see the Statue of Liberty. That's all done with. You're never going to see the Yankees or this or that. And what you're looking at is basically, you know, the form of cruelty was, it was amazing because it was promoted so greatly from that side. You had military officers coming over from fighting in China and having atrocities in China, right? And also going into Singapore. They said, you should kill all these men. Wow. And then they start using the emperor's name as like, you know, in the name of the emperor, right? So, you know, they start using that as an excuse to go after the soldiers. They said every 10 to 15 paces, an American or Filipino soldier was killed. So every 10 to 15 paces. So if we go from this end of, okay, where we're sitting here in terms of where we're filming to the end of the room, who knows? Maybe that could be 15 paces. That would be a dead body on the ground there. Officers' main job is to take care of their men. If they leaned over and helped a soldier that was sick, wounded, whatever the case was, they got bayoneted. So what you're looking at with Bataan, it comes back, okay? It takes a while for the news to come back, but it always comes out that this is what happened. And it's a very dark time within the American military because we're told to sit down, shut up, don't look at us. We're not going to give you any food and water. Now, what I said to you before is that Japanese soldiers were expected to march 25 miles a day. Well, those are soldiers that are in good shape. They're in the field. They have some resources. Now they expected the American soldiers to do the same, and they're eating bark off the trees, and they're eating grubs, and you know they're totally malnourished. They can't do that. It's impossible. And what the Japanese were doing was they were subbing in and out fresher soldiers to walk at a quicker pace. So their soldiers who were supposed to be in all this great shape got breaks. They were able to sleep at certain points. American soldiers were not. Keep on moving. And that's something that, you know, it's even to this day, you know, the Japanese, they don't do well with some of their history from World War II. And this is just one of the examples.
Shinzo Abe, before he was assassinated, was infamous for attending memorials for many of the accused war criminals. Thank you for this. Has been History Repeats on HMTV. Richard, can you stick around for another?
Sure.
All right.
No problem.